They came from outside the galaxy. They did not appear on any chart, ever warned of them. One day, the galaxy simply didn't know they existed, and then they were already here. The Yuuzhan Vong had been watching. For years, maybe decades, their advanced scouts had seeded the galaxy with organic spying devices, living creatures shaped to mimic common objects, breathing and recording everything. They had studied the Republic. They had studied the Jedi. They had mapped every weakness, every political fracture, every military gap left by the chaos of the galactic civil war. When they finally moved, they moved with the certainty of a species that had already won before firing a single shot, and they nearly were right. What followed was the bloodiest conflict in all of recorded galactic history. Not the Clone Wars, not the Galactic Civil War, not the ancient New Sith Wars that burned for 1,000 years. The Yuuzhan Vong War, which played out across 19 Legends novels, killed an estimated beings. Entire planets were stripped to bedrock, systems were abandoned, populations fled, governments crumbled. Coruscant itself, the capital of the New Republic, home to 1 trillion lives, the beating center of galactic civilization, fell. The Vong took it, renamed it, and began reshaping it into a grotesque imitation of a world they had lost 1,000 years before. And the Jedi nearly broke. Luke Skywalker, at the height of his power and reputation, watched his order lose some of its best. He watched his nephew die on a mission the Jedi themselves sent him on. He watched his wife nearly die from a disease engineered specifically to kill her. He spent years unsure whether the Force could even help against an enemy it could not feel, an enemy that existed as a blank space in the cosmic web that connected all living things. The Yuuzhan Vong were not in the Force. They were a hole in it. That detail alone should terrify you. In a universe where even the smallest bacteria have a Force signature, where every rock and cloud and dying star contributes to the living energy that the Jedi perceive, the Yuuzhan Vong was simply absent, invisible. Weapons the Force couldn't warn you about, ships the Force couldn't track, warriors whose emotions you couldn't read, whose movements you couldn't anticipate through any connection to the living Force. Fighting them felt, to Jedi, like trying to grab smoke, but their biology is only the beginning of the horror. The real horror is what they believed, what they built, and what they did to the worlds they conquered. So if you're here for deep Star Wars lore, for one of the most ambitious and devastating stories ever written in the Legends continuity, stay with me. This video covers all of it. The ancient history of the Vong, the culture and religion that made them what they were, the weapons and warriors who carried out the invasion, and the war itself, battle by battle, far away. It started in a different one entirely. The Yuuzhan Vong originated in a galaxy outside the Star Wars galaxy, across the intergalactic void. What that galaxy looked like in detail has never been fully chronicled. But what we know is enough to was a world called Yuuzhan'tar. In their own language, that name translates as Crèche of the Gods. It was a living planet, genuinely alive in the same way Zonama Sekot would later be alive. A conscious world that breathed and thought and communicated with the species that called it home. For a long time, the Yuuzhan Vong lived in symbiosis with describe a species woven into their homeworld's biology, a people who coexisted with their planet rather than exploiting it. The living technology that would later terrify the New Republic, the bioengineered ships, the living armor, the organic weapons, that knowledge came from Yuuzhan'tar itself. Logical warfare. It gave them the tools to fight back. They won, and something changed in them. The victory against the Abominor radicalized the Yuuzhan Vong. They developed an absolute non-negotiable hatred for mechanical technology, so central to their identity that it survived the death of the homeworld that gave it to them, survived millennia of wandering through the void, survived everything. When they arrived at the galaxy of the Jedi, 30,000 years after the victory over the Abominor, the Yuuzhan Vong expanded. They became conquerors, domain by domain, their equivalent of houses or clans. They fought each other as often as they fought outsiders. Upon is that the homeworld was destroyed in the aftermath of the Kremlavian War, lost in the cascading violence that the Yuuzhan Vong themselves had unleashed. Their wars had eaten their own planet. The creche of the gods was gone, and with it went something that the Legends novels would later reveal. The Exodus took place on enormous worldships, city-sized living vessels, grown rather than built, capable of sustaining entire populations through the intergalactic void. The journey lasted centuries, perhaps longer. The Yuuzhan Vong drifted in the darkness between galaxies, between stars, between everything, guided only by the vague theological conviction that the gods would deliver them to a new home. During those centuries, the religion calcified. With no living homeworld to anchor their spirituality, the Yuuzhan Vong built a pantheon, Yuuzhan, the creator god, the supreme and original, the god whose body had been sacrificed to create the universe. Yuuzhan'tar, the slayer, god of war and violence, patron of the warrior caste. Yuuzhan'tar, the trickster goddess, patron of deception agents. Yuuzhan and Yuuzhan, the twin gods of love and hate, who were always depicted bound together. Yuuzhan, the modeler, patron of the shaper caste. And Yuuzhan, the pardoner, the one deity who watched over the shamed ones, the outcasts, the implant rejectors, the lowest of the low, the only caste whose prayers she would receive. Every god demanded sacrifice. The Creator had sacrificed himself to make the universe. Therefore, the chosen race must sacrifice themselves to become worthy. Pain became theology. Scarification, body modification, and ritual bloodletting were acts of worship. A warrior who carried no scars was a warrior who had done nothing holy. A Yuuzhan Vong body mapped in old wounds and grafted organs was a body in constant conversation with the divine. This is what arrived at the edge of the galaxy, 25 years after the Battle of Yavin. A civilization of religious extremists carrying 30,000 years of war and exile and theological fervor, armed with living weapons that could resist lightsabers, invisible to the Force, and absolutely certain they had the divine right to take everything they saw. To understand how long the Yuuzhan Vong had been traveling, truly understand it, you need a number: 30,000 years. At the time of the invasion, the Galactic Republic had only existed for 25,000 years. The Jedi Order, which felt ancient and unshakable to anyone who had grown up in the Star Wars galaxy, was younger than the Yuuzhan Vong exile by 5 millennia. They had been crossing the void between galaxies for longer than the Republic had been governing the galaxy they were now invading. What does 30,000 years of exile do to a people? It calcifies everything. Every habit becomes sacred. Every adaptation becomes doctrine. The original reasons for things are forgotten, and the practices remain as if they were handed down from the gods themselves, because by that point they had been handed down from hundreds of generations, and the original reasons didn't matter anymore. The Vong who invaded the New Republic were not carrying the living memory of the Kremlavian War or the death of Yuuzhan'tar. Those were ancient history, preserved in religious texts and oral tradition, transformed from tragedy into mythology. They carried the structure those tragedies had built: the theology, the caste system, the hatred of machines. The wound had healed over into ideology. The worldships deserve more attention than they usually get. Picture a vessel the size of a small moon, grown from biological material across centuries of cultivation, not assembled, grown. The way a tree grows, the way coral grows, except guided by shapers who understood how to direct living tissue into forms that served specific functions. The outer hull was a living organism that could seal its own punctures. The interior atmosphere was maintained by biological systems analogous to lungs. Food was grown inside the ships. Water was cycled through organic filtration. Every mechanical function a Republic ship would have performed with metal and circuitry, a Yuuzhan Vong world ship performed with flesh and biology, and they were massive. A fully operational world ship could house hundreds of thousands of Vong, with additional capacity for the Chazrak slave workers and the enormous menageries of modified creatures that served as weapons, tools, and religious objects. During the intergalactic crossing, the world ship fleet spread across space in a loose formation that covered millions of kilometers. A drifting city civilization, dark and silent from the outside, ferociously alive within. The crossing itself is almost never discussed in the novels except in fragments, memories and mythology rather than documented history. But the implications of it are everywhere. 3,000 years of world ship life shaped Vong society in specific ways. It made scarcity sacred. You wasted nothing, because the world ship's biological systems could not produce infinite resources. It enforced the caste hierarchy with an iron hand, because in a closed system with limited resources, social chaos meant death. And it made conquest not just a religious imperative, but a survival necessity. The world ships could sustain the population indefinitely in theory, but they were aging. They needed resources. They needed a planet. Any planet. The theological certainty that the gods would provide one was also a pragmatic acknowledgement that the ships could not sustain a civilization forever. When scouts sent through gravitic anomalies identified the edge of the new galaxy, there was no debate about whether to go. There had never been any other option, but there was debate about how. And the debate about how reveals something that often gets lost in discussions of the Yuuzhan Vong as a monolithic evil. They were not actually unified. They were a civilization full of political conflict, theological disagreement, personal ambition, and factional maneuvering. Two supreme overlords in the period before the invasion demonstrated this directly. Supreme Overlord Coruscant, who led the species during the early scouting period, was cautious. He had received reports about Zanama Sekot, the living planet, the mystery in the outer rim that was somehow related to their lost homeworld. His theological advisors told him that the living planet was a warning from the gods, a sign that they were not ready. Coruscant chose not to invade. He believed the galaxy needed to be approached with reverence, not conquest. Chimera Jamane killed him for it. Chimera, or more precisely, the being operating through Chimera, staged a coup, declared Querial's Caution heresy, and had him executed as a coward who had shamed the Yuuzhan Vong species. The invasion was ordered. The fleet was assembled. The world ships turned toward the galaxy. The theological infrastructure Chimera built to justify the invasion was elaborate and cynical. He declared that the galaxy's inhabitants, specifically the species that had built mechanical technology, were abominations in the eyes of the gods. Droids were not merely offensive to Yuuzhan Vong philosophy. They were theological enemies, constructs that mocked the organic creation the gods had intended. To cleanse the galaxy of mechanical technology and replace it with living organic civilization was not conquest. It was divine mandate. It was the fulfillment of 30,000 years of exile. The moment when the Yuuzhan Vong finally earned their place at the side of Yuuzhan. That framing was convenient, and several of the more politically astute Vong could see through it. But it worked. When you have spent 30,000 years waiting for the gods to redeem your suffering, Any theology that offers that redemption will find followers. One more figure from the ancient history deserves mention. Yuuzhan himself, the War Master who unified the domains during the Kremlevian War and whose name became attached to the most devastating tactic in the Vong arsenal. Yuuzhan's core, the technique of using a dovin basal to accelerate a moon into a planet, destroying both, was originally developed as a desperation measure during the inter-domain wars. Two opposing forces, unable to dislodge each other from a contested world, would pull the planet's largest moon down onto it, rather than allow the other side to hold it. The tactic was considered extreme even by Yuuzhan Vong standards. Using it meant accepting that the world was lost, that the resources were forfeit, that all that remained was denial, pure destruction in place of victory. That Yuuzhan's core became the first thing the Yuuzhan Vong demonstrated to the New Republic at Cernpedal, with Chewbacca watching from a surface that was seconds from being struck by a falling moon, says something about the signal they were sending. They were announcing themselves with an act of pure annihilation, not conquest yet. First, terror. First, the lesson that when the Yuuzhan Vong chose to destroy something, there was nothing in the galaxy that could stop them from doing it. The domain system, the Yuuzhan Vong's version of clans or noble houses, structured not just social standing, but identity in ways that had no real equivalent in the Star Wars galaxy. A Yuuzhan Vong's full name always included their domain, Shadao Shai, Savong La, Nom Anor. The domain was heritage and obligation simultaneously. Warriors served the interests of their domain within the larger mission of the species. Shapers belonged to lineages of shaper domains that maintained specific biological knowledge. Priests came from domains with long ecclesiastical traditions. Domains competed with each other constantly for status and resources within the broader caste framework. A domain whose warriors performed well in battle gained favor with the Supreme Overlord and received priority access to new bioengineered weapons and armaments. A domain that produced a respected shaper of extraordinary skill could leverage that prestige into improved political standing. The internal politics were complex enough that several domains spent portions of the war pursuing their own strategic interests within the invasion, sometimes at the expense of overall Vong military efficiency. This was another thing Nom Anor understood about his own people that made him useful. The domain competitions were exploitable. When he needed a particular commander to take a specific action, he could often engineer it by presenting the action as an opportunity for domain glory rather than as a direct order. The warrior caste's internal rivalry was a steering mechanism, and Nom Anor was skilled at grabbing the wheel. The relationship between the domains and the concept of shame extended beyond the shamed ones as a caste. A domain could be shamed collectively if a major commander died dishonorably. If a significant mission failed through cowardice, the shame could stain the domain's name for generations. This created a pressure toward conspicuous bravery that sometimes overrode tactical sense. A domain warrior who could demonstrate extraordinary combat valor was not merely winning a personal honor. He was cleaning his lineage's name, restoring what might have been tarnished by a father's failure or a grandfather's disgrace. The Kremlevian War, which the novels reference as the defining internal conflict of the ancient Vong civilization, lasted long enough that multiple generations of domains lived and died within it. The specific disputes that started it were, by the time Yuuzhan ended it, lost in the overlapping grievances and retaliations that centuries of warfare produce. Yuuzhan's achievement was not resolving those grievances. They were unresolvable. His achievement was redirecting the energy they generated outward, giving the domains an external enemy to compete over, conquest of other species rather than conquest of each other. The same violence pointed in a different direction. Chimera's coup followed the same logic. The Yuuzhan Vong entering the new galaxy needed the same thing, an external target for the competitive violence their society generated constantly. Quarril's caution threatened to turn that energy inward again. Chimera offered the alternative. Whether he believed the theology he preached or was purely cynical about it is a question the novels never definitively resolve, and possibly by the end, the answer had become irrelevant because Chimera himself had become irrelevant. To understand the Yuuzhan Vong War, you have to understand the society conducting it. Because their military victories were not accidents, they were the product of a civilization designed, at every level, to produce warriors who could not be broken. The Yuuzhan Vong society was divided into distinct castes, and the caste you were born into determined almost everything about your life. At the top sat the supreme overlord, the single individual who was the political and religious authority of the entire species. The Supreme Overlord was considered the only being with direct communication to Yuuzhan, the Creator. He was, in the eyes of his people, one step short of divinity. His word was doctrine. His decisions were theology. Below the Supreme Overlord were the priests, who maintained and interpreted religious tradition, led worship, and held enormous political influence despite not commanding armies. Then came the warrior caste, the largest and most celebrated. Soldiers, commanders, war masters, the most visibly scarred and modified members of society who worshipped Yuuzhan'tar, the Slayer, with absolute devotion. Below the warriors were the shapers, the scientists and biological engineers who grew and modified all Yuuzhan Vong technology. Then the intendants, administrators and economic managers, and at the absolute bottom, partly inside the caste system and partly excluded from it, were the shamed ones. Shamed ones were Yuuzhan Vong whose bodies had rejected implants or modifications. This rejection was considered a theological verdict. If the gods did not accept your sacrifice, if your body refused the graft, then you were shamed permanently. You could not rise, could not worship at most temples, could not receive the blessings offered to other castes. You were, in a biological religious system that had no separation between science and faith, living proof of divine rejection. The worker caste performed manual labor and basic service functions. Chazrak, a reptilian slave species the Vong had subjugated long before their arrival in the new galaxy, filled many of the most degrading roles. Now the theology of pain. This is the part outsiders found most incomprehensible and most terrifying. Yuuzhan Vong warriors did not merely tolerate pain, they sought it, they curated it, they understood their own suffering, not as a failure of the body, but as a spiritual practice. The logic went like this. Yuuzhan sacrificed his body to create the universe. All the other gods sacrificed parts of themselves to make the galaxy and its inhabitants. The chosen race honors that sacrifice by sacrificing their own flesh, continuously, deliberately, and with full awareness of what they were doing. A warrior who lost an eye in battle might have it replaced with a grafted organ from another creature, not because the original eye couldn't be healed, but because the modification itself was an act of worship. A broken nose reset incorrectly became a testimony to endurance. Scarification patterns worn on the face and arms told the story of a warrior's religious journey in permanent, visible flesh. This created soldiers who were, by any measurable psychological standard, almost impossible to demoralize. Pain did not mean defeat to them. Pain meant they were alive and in conversation with their gods. A Yuuzhan Vong who was wounded and still fighting was not struggling, he was praying. The weapons matched the culture. Amphistaffs were living serpents that could harden into rigid staffs, go limp as a whip, spit acidic venom, and were resistant to lightsabers. Vondu in crab armor, plates of living shellfish fitted to the body were similarly resistant to blaster fire and lightsaber strikes, with weak points only at the joints. Coral skippers were living fighter craft, propelled by dovin basals that generated gravitational fields, used both for propulsion and as shields that could pull blaster bolts and even turbo laser fire into a singularity before it hit the hull. Their capital ships were worldships, the same massive living vessels that had carried their ancestors across the void. Now weaponized, crude, grown into configurations designed for war. A new Republic captain looking at a Yuuzhan Vong fleet saw nothing that matched any existing threat profile. No metal hulls, no ion drives, no known weapon signatures. Their battle computers had no data. Their combat doctrines had no answers. The Vong were also invisible to the Force. Every living thing in the galaxy has a Force signature. A rock doesn't, but a bacterium does. A Minoc does. Even a Hutt, who naturally resists Force influence, still registers as a presence. The Yuuzhan Vong registered as nothing, not as a suppressed presence, not as a dark side void, just absence. A Jedi reaching out with the Force toward a Yuuzhan Vong warrior felt nothing, as if the warrior didn't exist, and then the amphistaff caught them across the face. This terrified the Jedi Order more than any weapon. For 25 years after Endor, Luke Skywalker had rebuilt the Jedi. He had faced Vader, the Emperor, Dark Jedi, Sith clones. He understood how the Force moved in darkness and in light. The Vong short-circuited everything he knew about sensing and responding to threats. His Jedi students, trained from childhood to trust their connection to the Force as a combat aid, were suddenly fighting blind. And one more piece. The Yuuzhan Vong used a species of creature called a yamusk, a large tentacled organism, as a battlefield coordinator. A yamusk on a Yuuzhan Vong command ship could coordinate an entire fleet telepathically, linking every ship and warrior through organic communication that no New Republic signal jammer could touch. The Vong didn't transmit orders over comm channels. Their fleet moved as one organism, guided by a creature thinking for all of them simultaneously. The Yuuzhan Vong didn't invade blindly. For years before the actual assault began, advance agents had been operating inside the galaxy. The most important of them was Nom Anor, technically a member of the Intendant caste, though he operated at the intersection of every caste's interests, serving as a spy, saboteur, and political manipulator of extraordinary skill. Nom Anor had been active in the New Republic's political circles for over a decade before the invasion. He had infiltrated governments, stoked conflicts, accelerated the fractures already present in the post-Endor political order. He was not alone, but he was the most effective. His assignment was to ensure that when the Yuuzhan Vong fleet finally arrived, it arrived at a galaxy already weakened, already divided, already unsure of itself. He succeeded. The New Republic in 25 ABY, 25 years after the Battle of Yavin, was not the confident new democratic order that had defeated the Empire. It was a government still arguing over its own structure, still managing the aftermath of Imperial remnant negotiations, still sorting out which systems had full Senate voting rights and which didn't. Its military, the New Republic Defense Force, had never recovered the unified command structure of the old Imperial fleet, or even the rebellion's leaner wartime discipline. There were good officers, good ships, good pilots. There was no coherent doctrine for fighting an enemy the galaxy had never imagined. The first confirmed contact with the Yuuzhan Vong happened at Helska 4, a frozen world in the Outer Rim. A Yuuzhan Vong force under Prefect Dargara arrived there and began establishing a base, using an enormous yamusk to exert influence over nearby space. An initial confrontation cost the New Republic ships they could barely afford to lose. and the Battle of Helska 4 ended with a Jedi strike team managing to destroy the world itself, freezing the Yamusk inside a frozen sea and triggering a catastrophic ice quake that shattered the planet. It was a victory, a Pyrrhic, costly, brutally difficult victory against a preliminary force. The Yuuzhan Vong main fleet had not yet arrived. Chewbacca died at Cernpedal. The story of Cernpedal is worth stopping on because it established immediately that the new Jedi Order series, the 19 novel run by multiple authors that chronicled the Yuuzhan Vong War, was going to operate by different rules than anything Star Wars had done before. Characters who mattered, characters who had survived the Clone Wars and the Galactic Civil War and everything else, were going to die. The Vong were going to cost something real. A Yuuzhan Vong advance force used their Yogan's core tactic, a technique invented by that ancient war master during the Kremlevian War on Cernpedal. By positioning a dovin basal on the planet's surface and tuning it to pull on the planet's largest moon, they accelerated the moon's descent. Cernpedal's moon began to fall. The evacuation was panicked, chaotic, insufficient. Han Solo's Millennium Falcon was there. His sons Anakin and Jacen were there. Chewbacca was there. Chewbacca threw Anakin back to the Falcon. He didn't make it himself. The Falcon launched as the moon struck. That's the tone of this story. From the first major engagement, you understand that the Yuuzhan Vong were not another threat to be defeated without cost. They were a catastrophe, and the galaxy was about to spend 5 years finding that out, one dead world at a time. The death of Chewbacca requires more than a plot summary. He had been alive for over 2 centuries. He had served alongside Han Solo since before the Battle of Yavin, since a debt of life that the Wookiee tradition of life debt turned into one of the most enduring partnerships in Star Wars history. He had survived the Galactic Civil War, had watched his oldest friend become a husband and father, had known the Solo children since they were born. He had outlasted the Empire. He died throwing a teenager back onto a ship. Anakin Solo, 17 years old, was caught on the surface when the countdown to the moon's impact became a countdown to seconds. Chewbacca reached him, got him back aboard, and then the Falcon had to leave because there was no time left. And if the Falcon didn't leave, then Chewbacca wasn't the only one who died. Han Solo piloted his ship away from the surface while his friend died on it. He watched in the rear sensors as the moon came down. The response of the Han Solo character across the following novels is sometimes described as a breakdown, but it's more specific than that. Han Solo's entire adult identity had been built on a few constants: his ship, his Wookiee co-pilot, his capacity for improvised survival against impossible odds. Cernpedal struck directly at all 3. The ship had survived, but only by leaving someone behind. The co-pilot was gone, and the odds had, for the first time, not been beaten. He had not found a clever solution. The moon had simply fallen, and the best he could do was choose which people would die. He blamed Anakin, not entirely rationally. There was nothing Anakin had done to cause any of this, but Han's grief needed somewhere to land, and landing it on a son who had survived when Chewbacca had not was psychologically coherent, even while being psychologically wrong. The relationship between Han and Anakin, already somewhat strained by the difference between who Han Solo was as a legend and who he was as a father, fractured at Cernpedal and didn't fully heal before Anakin died. This is one of the things the new Jedi Order series understood that a lot of Star Wars storytelling avoids. Grief is not clean. It doesn't follow the shape of the story. It attaches to wrong objects. It makes people behave badly toward people they love. It persists past the narrative convenience. Han Solo's grief over Chewbacca was still shaping his behavior years later, well into the middle of the war. The Helska 4 battle is worth more attention for a different reason. It introduced Prefect Agara, the commander of the advance force, and through him something important about how the Vong understood military hierarchy and sacrifice. Dagera was not the most senior Yuuzhan Vong to enter the galaxy. He was a mid-rank commander leading an advance probe, tasked with establishing a forward base and beginning the process of psychological pressure on the New Republic. When the Helska 4 base was destroyed, when the Jedi strike team froze the Yamosk and shattered the planet around it, Dagera died with it. From a New Republic perspective, this was a victory. From the Yuuzhan Vong perspective, the sacrifice of an advance force to draw enemy attention, test their capabilities, and cost them resources was entirely within the acceptable parameters of the mission. Dagera's death was not a loss, it was information. The main fleet learned what the New Republic could do and how far it was willing to go before the main fleet arrived. The victory at Helska 4 was also a scouting report. This is worth understanding about Yuuzhan Vong tactical doctrine. They were willing to expend assets that no other military in the galaxy would consider expendable. Spending warriors, ships, and commanders to gather intelligence was not waste, it was investment. The theology that made pain a virtue also made sacrifice a rational tactic. A warrior who died giving the fleet information about enemy capabilities had died honorably. Their life had purchased something. The New Republic spent years trying to replicate the morale and commitment of the Yuuzhan Vong warrior class and couldn't. Not because the Republic's soldiers were less brave, but because bravery in a secular military is fundamentally different from theological certainty. A Republic soldier who dies fighting does so out of duty, loyalty, and courage. A Yuuzhan Vong warrior who dies fighting does so on the way to a god. That difference, multiplied across an entire military force, creates something that conventional strategic analysis couldn't account for. There were also the Vong who arrived before the army, the ones who had been living in the galaxy for years as sleepers, advance agent networks beyond Nom Anor. Living creatures seeded throughout key systems, masker creatures that mimicked rocks or furniture, recording conversations and movement patterns for years. Some of these were discovered during the early war period, when Shaper analysis teams began studying Vong biological material captured in raids and realized that some of the creatures recovered looked like they had been engineered for surveillance rather than combat. The galaxy had been watched. For how long, nobody was sure. The psychological effect of that revelation on the New Republic Senate was significant. If organic surveillance organisms had been embedded in government buildings, in military command centers, in private residences of key officials, and if those organisms had been there for years, then the Vong had advanced knowledge of Republic deployments, personnel structures, defensive strategies, and political vulnerabilities that went well beyond what Nom Anor alone could have provided. The Republic had been effectively living inside an intelligence operation it didn't know existed. That paranoia was impossible to fully resolve. You can scan for droids and electronic surveillance equipment. You cannot run a biological scan on every piece of furniture in every government building without shutting down all operations indefinitely. The Republic tried to manage it through protocols and compartmentalization. They largely failed because the problem was architectural. It was baked into every building they occupied. Nom Anor's specific career within the New Republic's political environment is worth tracing because it illustrates exactly how the invasion's soft phase worked. He entered the galaxy years before the invasion under a variety of identities, building credentials. By the time the war began, he had embedded himself as a political figure of some, standing on several worlds, with contacts in Republic intelligence, diplomatic circles, and commercial networks. He had studied the species around him with the patience of someone who knew they had years to work with, and the discipline of someone trained since childhood to maintain an alien identity indefinitely. What he had been doing across those years was identifying and widening fractures. The New Republic's political structure was full of them. Species that resented the Senate's core world bias, systems that felt underrepresented, military officers who disagreed with civilian oversight, merchants who found Republic trade law inconvenient. None of these fractures were unique to the Republic. They are the normal fault lines of any large governing coalition. What Nom Anor did was identify which ones were load-bearing and apply pressure to them. He didn't need to create the fractures. He needed to prevent them from healing. That's a much easier task. Every time a promising diplomatic initiative between two estranged Republic member species began showing results, Nom Anor could introduce a piece of damaging information, an intercepted communication, a fabricated accusation that reset the relationship to distrust. Every military reform effort that might have produced a unified command structure could be sabotaged by feeding the opposing political factions the arguments they needed to block it. The New Republic that the Yuuzhan Vong invaded was a republic that had been quietly tended for years to stay exactly as divided and uncoordinated as it was. Nom Anor had not built that division from scratch. He had maintained it. He was not, it should be said, omnipotent. He had failures. Some of his assets were discovered. Some of his manipulations produced unintended consequences. The history of intelligence operations is full of moments where a carefully constructed deception becomes too complex to manage, and Nom Anor operated in a galaxy-wide political environment with variables no individual could fully control. But he was good enough, and the Republic was dysfunctional enough, that the net result was the weakened target the invasion fleet arrived at. The early phase of the invasion had a specific shape. Hit the outer rim, establish territory, push toward the core, and use each victory to demoralize the next system before the fleet arrived. Dubrillion was a significant early target. The Vong hit it hard, establishing a forward base and giving the New Republic its first real sustained engagement with their fleet tactics. The battle made clear what many officers had begun to suspect, that conventional Republic fleet doctrine was near useless against Yuuzhan Vong formation. Turbo laser fire got pulled into dovin basal singularities before it reached the coral hulls. The living ships absorbed damage and healed, and they coordinated through the Yamosk with a fluidity that left New Republic tactical officers staring at battle readouts they couldn't interpret. Garki was where the Jedi discovered something important. A team led by Corran Horn and Jacen Solo, operating behind Vong lines, was cornered in a grove of Bafora trees, a species transplanted from the planet Ithor. When the pursuing Yuuzhan Vong warriors closed in, something unexpected happened. The pollen of the Bafora trees triggered a catastrophic allergic reaction in the Vonduan crab armor. The living armor suffocated. The warriors died. Bafora trees were native to Ithor. The Vong moved immediately toward Ithor. The Battle of Ithor is one of the darkest moments in the entire war, and it has a particular cruelty to it. Ithor was a beautiful world, one of the most ecologically protected in the galaxy. Its jungles so pristine that the Ithorians who called it home had lived in floating sky cities for generations rather than touch the forest floor. The Baffa Groves were part of an ecosystem centuries in the making. Yuuzhan Vong commander Shadao Shai issued a challenge to Jedi Knight Corran Horn. Single combat, winner takes the planet. If Corran won, the Vong would withdraw. If Shai won, he would receive the remains of his ancestor, remains Corran had taken from a previous battle, and the Vong would have Ithor. A one-week peace accord was agreed to, allowing Republic ships to begin evacuating the population. Corran won the duel. Shadao Shai died. Colonel Meru Dane, a Republic officer who had watched his own family die to the Vong, had rigged a biohazard weapon during the peace accord. When it launched, it contaminated Ethor's atmosphere. The Yuuzhan Vong, furious at the violation of the terms, completed what the weapon began. They released their own ecological destroyer. Within days, Ethor's forests, irreplaceable, ancient, gone, were dead. The planet became a wasteland. Corran Horn was blamed for Ethor's destruction by many in the Republic. The logic was irrational but emotionally comprehensible. He had made the deal. He had won the duel, and still Ethor died. He went into self-imposed exile. Meanwhile, the political situation in the New Republic was deteriorating in ways that matched Nom Anor's designs almost perfectly. The Senate was divided over how aggressively to respond. Some delegates, facing their own system's military unreadiness, advocated for negotiated withdrawal, a policy that would effectively concede the Outer Rim to give the core time to fortify. Chief of State Borsk Failure, a Bothan politician whose entire career had been built on interspecies political maneuvering, struggled to build the kind of wartime consensus that the moment demanded. Luke Skywalker tried to maintain the Jedi Order's role as a military asset, while also wrestling with the fundamental philosophical challenge the Vong posed. He retreated from active command of the Order for a period, shaken by deaths and uncertainty. He questioned whether his leadership was adequate. The vacuum this created caused fractures within the Jedi themselves, with some, like Kip Duran, advocating for a far more aggressive, offensive approach than Luke's careful restraint. Jacen Solo went through his own crisis. Captured by the Vong and subjected to weeks of torture under the instruction of Verger, a mysterious figure who was herself a former Old Republic Jedi and now something else entirely. Jacen emerged with a fundamentally different relationship to the Force. Verger's teachings defied easy categorization. She showed him that pain could be chosen rather than merely endured. She showed him that the Force had no inherent light side or dark side, only choices made within it. He emerged harder, more dangerous, changed in ways that would have consequences reaching well past the war itself. Anakin Solo, the youngest of the 3 Solo children and, in the estimation of many in the Order, the most naturally gifted Force user of his generation, led the mission that would both define and end him. The Vong had developed a biological weapon specifically targeted at the Jedi, the Voxin. These creatures were genetically engineered hunters capable of sensing Jedi through the Force, immune to lightsaber cuts, able to project sonic attacks that disrupted Force connection, and coated in acid. A Voxin queen on the world ship over Mirka was producing them by the hundreds. Anakin led a strike team, a group of Jedi young adults, into the world ship to kill the queen. The mission succeeded, but the cost was enormous. Multiple Jedi died on the ship, killed by Voxin and Yuuzhan Vong warriors. Anakin himself died killing the queen, expending himself in a final Force surge that destroyed the creature and ended the breeding program. He was 18 years old. His death broke his father. Han Solo, who had never been easy with grief, fell into a depression that separated him from Leia and lasted years. It broke Jacen, who had watched his brother die and done nothing, convinced in his post-Vergia state that he needed to observe rather than act. And it broke the wider Jedi community, which had staked enormous hope on Anakin as the future of the Order. We're about halfway through this story, and things are about to get much worse. If you're watching this and you want to see the rest of this series, the politics, the personal tragedies, the final battle, subscribe and drop a comment below. The algorithm sends this video to more people when you engage with it, which means more people learn about some of the best storytelling Star Wars legends ever produced. The fall of Coruscant was not a surprise. By the time the Yuuzhan Vong fleet made its move toward the core, The New Republic's military had been bled white across years of sustained engagements. Planet after planet had fallen or been evacuated. The Outer Rim was largely Vong territory. Several mid-rim systems had declared neutrality or, in the worst cases, accommodation with the invaders. The political center of the Republic had become so consumed by internal argument that coherent strategic response was nearly impossible to organize. When the Vong came for Coruscant, the Republic couldn't stop them. The battle itself was catastrophic in scale. The Yuuzhan Vong deployed a tactic they called a Yogan's Core variant, pulling asteroids from nearby space to rain down on the planet's shields while their fleet engaged the orbital defenses. The battle lasted days. Chief of State Borsk Failure, the Bothan politician who had spent years managing rather than leading, spent his final hours trapped in the Senate building as Vong warriors closed in. When they reached him, he detonated a bomb hidden in his office, killing himself and taking several hundred Vong warriors with him. Whatever his failures in governance, that end had a particular defiant dignity. Coruscant fell. The Yuuzhan Vong renamed it Yuuzhan'tar, the name of their long-dead homeworld, the name that meant creche of the gods. They began reshaping it. Biots were released across the city planet, eating durasteel, breaking down plasteel, converting the artificial surface into something organic. The skyscrapers that had defined the Coruscant skyline for 10,000 years began to dissolve. In their place, the Vong grew coral and vine and living architecture. They were making their new capital, their recovered paradise, from the bones of the Republic's heart. The symbolic weight of this act cannot be overstated. Coruscant was the galaxy. It was where the Republic Senate had sat for 25,000 years. It was where the Jedi Temple had stood until Palpatine burned it. It was the geographic and psychological center of everything that defined the galactic civilization. To lose it was not just a military defeat, it was a statement about who owned the future. Supreme Overlord Shimara Jamani took up residence on the conquered Coruscant, sitting atop his new Yuuzhan'tar, issuing orders from the highest living tower the Shapers had grown. He was physically enormous, modified beyond any normal Vong warrior, attended by a strange jester called Onimi, who tumbled and rhymed and seemed deeply, inexplicably content to be near the Supreme Overlord at all times. The New Republic was dissolved and reformed as the Galactic Federation of Free Alliances, the Galactic Alliance, under new Chief of State Cal Omas. The restructuring was more than administrative. It was an acknowledgement that the old Confederate model of the Republic could not fight this war. The new alliance centralized authority, tightened military command, and tried to establish something like a coherent war strategy for the first time since the invasion began. A new war master led the Yuuzhan Vong forces, Savong La, who replaced the killed Dagara and several subsequent war masters. La was a fanatic even by Yuuzhan Vong standards. He had his foot replaced with a Radank claw as a sacrifice to the gods. He pursued the Jedi with a focused hatred, demanding their surrender to the Vong in exchange for a ceasefire that no serious analyst believed he intended to honor. He ordered mass executions of prisoners and the systematic enslavement of conquered populations. And somewhere below all of this, something was growing in the occupied city. The shamed ones, the lowest caste, the rejected, the implant failures were hearing something they had never heard before. Jacen Solo, before his capture, had made contact with shamed ones. During his torture, something had passed between Verge's teachings and the Force and the shamed ones who witnessed Jedi powers. A heresy was forming, the Jedi heresy. The belief that the Jedi in Vong, were not enemies of the gods, but avatars of them. That the Force, the energy the Jedi served, was not blasphemy but another face of the divine. that the shamed ones' rejection by their society was not a theological verdict, but a sign that they were meant for something else. For the shamed ones, it was the first theological offer of dignity they had ever received. Borsk's failure is worth revisiting for a moment, because the history's verdict on him is complicated and the complexity is earned. For most of the New Republic era, Borsk's failure had been a political antagonist, a Bothan senator, later chief of state, who operated through strategic calculation and factional maneuvering rather than moral clarity. He had, in his career, done things that cost lives through political cowardice. He had undermined military operations for political advantage. He was not a hero figure, and the Legends novels did not pretend otherwise. But the bomb in the office tells a different story about who he was under pressure. When the Vong finally came for him personally, when there were no more political moves left, when the building was going to fall regardless of anything he did, he didn't try to negotiate, didn't try to surrender, didn't try to escape. He spent his final minutes building a charge that would take as many of them with him as he could manage. Several hundred Yuuzhan Vong warriors died with Borsk's failure. For a politician who had often been characterized as self-serving, that ending carries a strange weight. Whatever he had been as a bureaucrat in peace, when it came to it, he killed himself rather than let them take him, and he took as much of the enemy as he possibly could. The transformation of Coruscant into Yuuzhan'tar was a process that took months to become fully visible, but the early stages were immediately disorienting to anyone watching from a distance. The city planet had been built over millennia, layers upon layers of construction, the original planetary surface so deep under accumulated infrastructure that most Coruscanti had never seen bare rock in their lives. The uppermost levels were the center of galactic government, entertainment, and commerce. Below them, all the way down to the lower levels that never saw sunlight, were the maintenance corridors, the power infrastructure, the water processing, the criminal networks, and the forgotten populations of the Undercity. The Yuuzhan Vong biots that were released to begin the terraforming were not discriminating. They consumed everything, the gleaming Senate towers and the Undercity slums, with equal biological appetite. The living conversion worked from the outside in, organic material spreading across the surface like mold on a petri dish, but purposeful, guided by shaper protocols that directed the growth. Coral structures began emerging from the dissolving durasteel. Vines consumed communications towers. The climate control systems that had maintained Coruscant's artificial weather patterns failed as the infrastructure they depended on was eaten, and the planet's weather began to shift. The trapped heat of a city world without regulation, producing atmospheric conditions nobody had experienced in living memory. The trillion inhabitants of Coruscant at the time of the battle were not all evacuated. The battle had come faster than the evacuation could manage. Large civilian populations, people who hadn't made it off, were now living inside a planet undergoing active terraforming. Some survived in pockets, in structures the biots hadn't reached yet. Others were captured and enslaved. The shamed ones who had been brought with the invasion fleet found themselves assigned to the lower levels, the deepest parts of the new Yuuzhan'tar, as laborers, maintaining the edges of the transformation. This is where the Jedi heresy would grow. The Vong, who became shamed in the normal course of the invasion, warriors whose implants had failed, workers whose bodies had rejected modifications, were added to the existing population of the low caste and assigned to the underworld. They lived in the dark, in the spaces between the coral growth and the surviving Old Republic infrastructure, working and praying to Yuuzhan, the only god who would hear them. And in those spaces, the stories about Jedi spread. Some of the shamed ones had witnessed things during the invasion. A Jedi who could stop a volley of Vong weapons with a gesture. Another who survived conditions that should have killed any living thing. The theology of the warrior caste said this was because the Jedi were an abomination, a perversion of natural life. But the theology of the shamed ones, always quietly looking for an explanation of their own rejection that didn't require accepting that the gods hated them, reached a different conclusion. What if the Jedi were touched by something the warrior caste didn't understand? What if the Force was not an enemy of the gods, but one of their instruments? The heresy gave the shamed ones something that their official theology never had, a reason to believe their condition was not a verdict, but a calling. The gods had shamed them, not because they were unworthy, but because they were meant to receive a different truth. Nom Anor eventually found this and understood immediately that it was a weapon, or that it would become one if it grew large enough. What he didn't anticipate was that it would also become something that changed him. The fall of Coruscant also marked the effective death of a specific version of New Republic optimism. The generation that had fought at Yavin and Endor had believed with some justification that the galaxy's worst period was behind it. The Empire had fallen. The Sith had died with Palpatine. The New Republic was imperfect but real, and it was growing, and the Jedi were back, and the dark time was over. That belief died with Coruscant. The galaxy that emerged from the occupation of its capital was harder, less certain of any future, and had looked directly into the possibility of total civilizational collapse, and survived it only because the Vong had chosen occupation over pure annihilation. The Vong could have glassed Coruscant from orbit. They didn't, because they wanted it as their new homeworld. That specific desire, a desire to possess rather than simply destroy, was the one tactical mercy the entire war contained. Leia Organa Solo's experience of Coruscant's fall was unlike her experience of any other catastrophe in a life that had contained many. She had grown up on a political world, Alderaan, and had watched it destroyed from the Death Star's observation port. She had spent decades in the Senate, and then the rebellion, and then the new government that replaced the Empire. She knew Coruscant in a way that few living people did, as the world where political power resided, where the mechanisms of galactic governance ran, where the arguments that shaped hundreds of billions of lives happened in marble corridors. Watching it fall meant watching something she had spent her adult life serving simply stop existing. The New Republic that she had helped found was not just militarily defeated at Coruscant. It was effectively ended there. The continuity of democratic governance that she had been fighting for since she was 19 years old, carrying secret plans inside a droid across a blockade, was severed at Coruscant. The Galactic Alliance that replaced it was different in ways she understood intellectually and felt differently than she could fully articulate. She kept working. She had always kept working. It was how she had managed Alderaan, and it was how she managed everything. But the people who knew her noticed, in the months after Coruscant's fall, a quality of exhaustion that was different from mere tiredness. She was exhausted in the specific way of someone who has spent their whole life building something and watched it knocked down and has to decide whether to start again. The theological dimensions of what the Vong were doing to Coruscant were not lost on the Jedi either. When the Yuuzhan Vong called the planet Yuuzhan'tar and began transforming it, they were doing something the Force could feel. The living organisms they were releasing, the biots eating the durasteel, the coral growing, were Force present in the way all living things were. For the first time in the war, Jedi could feel the enemy's work through the Force. Not the warriors, not the ships, the Vong themselves remained blank. But the planet's transformation was alive, and the Force registered it. Luke Skywalker, meditating during the first weeks of the occupation, described the sensation as something like grief. The Force felt the trillion-layered civilization of Coruscant being unmade, Not just the deaths. That would have been familiar, horrible, known. It was the dissolution of the accumulated living presence of a world that had been inhabited by conscious beings for 30 millennia. Every generation that had lived and died on Coruscant had left something in the Force. That accumulated weight was being converted, not erased, but transformed into something unrecognizable. It was not silence, it was the wrong kind of sound. War Master Savong La died at Abak 9. The Battle of Abak 9 was a trap. Jaina Solo, Han and Leia's daughter, had by this point become perhaps the most dangerous Jedi pilot in the New Republic's fleet. After Anakin's death, she had thrown herself into combat with an intensity that alarmed her family and impressed her commanders. The Vong had begun to call her Sword of the Jedi, a title she wore with complicated feelings. At Abak 9, Savong La pursued what he thought was a retreating Republic force into a mining moon with no clear exit route. It was intentional. He was given what looked like a perfect kill and took the bait. The Republic forces that had appeared to flee were now behind him, cutting off retreat. La was pinned on the moon with no fleet support. In the close fighting that followed, he died. His replacement as War Master was Naz Choka, a more pragmatic and less purely fanatical officer. The change in Vong leadership brought a slight shift in strategic approach, though the invasion continued. Nom Anor's story took a turn at this point that reveals something crucial about Yuuzhan Vong's society. It was as susceptible to internal politics as any other civilization. After a failed mission at Abak 9 that brought him personal disgrace, Nom Anor fled Shimura's wrath by disguising himself as a shamed one. He went underground in the occupied Coruscant, living among the workers and outcasts he had spent his entire career manipulating. There he encountered the Jedi heresy, and in a move that was either calculated or desperate or both, he became its prophet. Under the identity of Yuuzhan, the prophet, he led the underground movement among shamed ones and workers, preaching the divinity of the Jedi and the falseness of the warrior caste's supremacy. He did this, initially, entirely for his own political survival. The movement itself was real, but Nom Anor's belief in it was not. Then something complicated happened. The movement grew past his ability to control it. The shamed ones were actually listening. They were actually believing. They were actually willing to die for it. And Nom Anor, manipulator of systems, found himself trapped inside one of his own fabrications. Meanwhile, an entirely different thread was pulling toward resolution: Zonama Sekot. The living planet had been known since before the war. The previous Supreme Overlord Quorrail had actually chosen not to invade the galaxy specifically because of it. He recognized it as something the gods had placed as a warning. Shimira overturned that decision and had Quorrail killed. Shimma's fear of Zonama Sekot was real and deep, the source of a paranoia that would eventually tip into grandiosity. He became convinced that his greatest war was not against the Galactic Alliance. It was against the gods themselves, who he believed had grown jealous of the Vong's strength and were conspiring to destroy them. A Jedi mission led by a team including Tahiri Vela and Corran Horn was sent to find Zonama Sekot. Nom Anor, still playing prophet, managed to insert himself into the mission. When the group arrived at the living planet, Nom Anor showed his hand. He killed the Shaper Nen Yim, pushed the priest Harar off a cliff, and tried to sabotage the planet's hyperdrive. He escaped. The Jedi failed to undo his sabotage. Zonama Sekot undid it itself. The living planet, aware in ways that organic organisms usually aren't, understood what had happened. It jumped into hyperspace, and when it returned to normal space, It was in orbit around Coruscant. The arrival of Zonama Sekut above occupied Coruscant caused chaos in the Yuuzhan Vong command structure that no military strike had managed. It was the living thing Quareel had feared. It was the portent Shimura had built his entire leadership around suppressing. Its arrival confirmed to the Shamed Ones and the Jedi heretics that the gods were not with the Supreme Overlord. And it confirmed to Shimura himself, in whatever remained of his rational mind, that the end was near. The Galactic Alliance fleet moved toward Coruscant, now Yuuzhan'tar. The final battle was beginning. The Jaina Solo who fought at Ebok 9 was not the Jaina Solo who had existed before the war. She had entered the Vong conflict as an exceptional Jedi pilot and a young woman still sorting out her relationship to the Force, her family, and her own identity. By the time she set the trap for Tsavan La, she was something harder. Grief for Anakin had burned away whatever hesitancy remained in her. The Vong had named her the Sword of the Jedi based on their own mythology, a figure who brings death, unstoppable, aligned with a divine pattern they couldn't fully read. She had accepted the title not because she found it flattering, but because she found it useful. If the Vong were afraid of what she represented, that fear was a weapon. The parents watched from a distance and were frightened by what they saw. Not because she was becoming something dark, but because she had stopped flinching. There's a particular kind of grief a parent carries when their child becomes capable in ways the parent can't follow. Han and Leia understood war, but Jaina had gone somewhere in herself that they couldn't accompany her to. The trap at Ebok 9 worked because Tsavan La was given what he genuinely wanted, and genuine desire makes the best bait. He wanted the Sword of the Jedi. He wanted the confirmation of his own theology. If he could destroy this figure who the Shamed Ones were whispering about, who carried some divine implication he couldn't name, then the gods were still with him. The bait was theological, not just tactical. When La died on Ebok 9, he died fighting. The accounts in the novels don't give him a coward's end. He was a fanatic, and he was brutal, and he had ordered atrocities, but when the end came, he met it like a warrior. That's the thing about the Yuuzhan Vong antagonists. The novels almost never gave them cheap deaths. Even the worst of them died according to their own values, which is a kind of tragic dignity that complicates simple hatred. The theology of Tsavan La's Radank Claw deserves a specific moment. He had replaced his own foot with it as a sacrifice to the gods. A Radank is a large, dangerous creature. The claw was functional in the sense that he could walk on it, but the movement it produced was different from a normal foot, more labored, visibly altered. Every step he took was a visible sacrifice. The warriors around him could see, every time he moved, the price he had voluntarily paid for divine favor. His authority was partly based on demonstrated willingness to suffer for the gods in ways his subordinates had not. When the Radank Claw was rejected by his body, as implants sometimes were, as was the biological risk inherent in living modification, Tsavan La refused to have it removed. The rejection was spreading, causing systemic damage. His own body was at war with its modification, and he kept it because the alternative was acknowledging that the gods were not honoring his sacrifice, which was a theological verdict he could not accept without losing his identity as War Master and as a Yuuzhan Vong of unquestioned standing. He died with an arm that was killing him because removing it would have meant the gods had rejected him. That is what theological certainty costs you when the theology is wrong. Nen Yim's arc through the middle portion of the war represents something unique in the new Jedi Order series. A Yuuzhan Vong character who from inside her own civilization began to question it. Nenyim was a master shaper of genuine brilliance who had run out of sacred protocols, the approved biological formulae that guided all shaper work. Protocols were supposed to be the complete repository of shaper knowledge, preserved from ancient times, sufficient for any purpose. When Nenyim discovered that the protocols were incomplete, that there were problems her civilization faced for which the approved protocols had no solution, she did something forbidden. She experimented. She developed new techniques from first principles rather than inherited wisdom. This was heresy. In a civilization where all knowledge was considered already given by the gods through tradition, the act of generating new knowledge was implicitly a claim that the tradition was insufficient, that the gods had not given everything, that a shaper's own intelligence could produce something the divine protocols hadn't anticipated. She was right. The protocols were incomplete because they were ancient, preserved imperfectly, and the civilization's circumstances had changed in ways the original shapers hadn't anticipated. The scientific reality was that independent discovery was necessary, but the theological reality was that independent discovery was blasphemy. Nenyim operated in secret, and the things she discovered threatened not just her own safety, but the entire architecture of her civilization's self-understanding. Her story, more than any other single character thread in the Vong sections of the new Jedi Order, makes the case that the Yuuzhan Vong civilization was destroying itself from the inside at the same time the Galactic Alliance was destroying it from the outside. The Jedi heresy and Nenyim's scientific heresy were the two internal fractures that made the civilization unable to sustain the war, even if the fleet had survived. You cannot maintain total ideological control of a civilization indefinitely. The cracks were always there. The war just accelerated the pressure on them. Zonama Sikot's history, which the Jedi discovered during their mission to find it, filled in pieces of the Vong origin story that the Vong themselves had lost or suppressed. The living planet had knowledge of what the Yuuzhan Vong homeworld had been. It carried, in its biological memory, traces of the original Yuuzhan'tar. In a sense, it was Yuuzhan'tar's last child, a fragment of the living world that had escaped the destruction of the Kremlevian War and drifted through space, growing, becoming something new but carrying the original DNA of everything the Vong had been before the wars. This is why Shimara feared it. If Zonama Sikot arrived in the galaxy and the Shaman ones saw it, they would have living proof that the gods had preserved something of the original home rather than destroyed it entirely in punishment. They would have evidence that the exile was not divine condemnation, but divine preservation. And if the exile was preservation rather than punishment, then the theology that justified the invasion, the theology that said conquest was the earned right of a suffering people, collapsed. Shimara had known this. He had killed the previous Supreme Overlord rather than face it. And now, as the Galactic Alliance fleet formed up and the living planet hung in orbit above his throne, he was going to have to face it anyway. The siege of occupied Coruscant was fought on multiple fronts simultaneously. In space, the Galactic Alliance fleet, supplemented by Imperial Remnant forces and Chiss Ascendancy ships, clashed with the Yuuzhan Vong fleet under War Master Naz Choka. The living Vong ships fought with their usual terrible coordination, Yamosks linking the fleet into a single organism, dovin basals deflecting Republic fire. But the Alliance had spent 5 years studying Vong tactics, and the fleet that arrived was not the one that had lost Coruscant. It knew how to target Yamosks. It knew where coral hull weak points developed after sustained engagement. The battle was not easy, but it was different. On the surface of the terraformed world, Galactic Alliance ground forces fought through jungles and coral structures where skyscrapers had stood. The shamed ones, responding to the Jedi heresy's call, turned against their own overseers in the chaos, sabotaging Vong defenses from within, opening paths for Alliance troops, dying in numbers to bring the warriors down. Luke Skywalker went for Shimura directly. The Supreme Overlord received him in his throne room, a vast, grotesque living hall grown from the planet's new organic skin. Luke faced him in combat, and it was, by any account, one of the hardest fights of his life. Shimura was enormous, modified, fanatical, and had been augmented by Animi's force manipulation in ways Luke couldn't fully pass. The fight should have killed Luke. It nearly did. Shimura fell. Luke killed him. But the worldship above didn't die, and the Yuuzhan Vong, who were force-sensitive, and there was at least one, which should not have been possible, felt nothing yet. Jacen Solo found Onimi, the jester, the tumbling, rhyming little figure who had been at Shimura's side for the entire war, performing and capering and whispering. Onimi, the shamed one. Animi, the former Master Shaper, who had once attempted to graft Yamosk tissue, the telepathic force-adjacent tissue of the battlefield coordinator organism, directly onto his own brain. The procedure had worked, partially. It had given him force sensitivity. It had also deformed him, shaming him by Yuuzhan Vong standards, marking him as rejected by the gods. Rather than accept his exile, Onimi had done the one thing no shamed one in history had managed. He had enslaved the Supreme Overlord. For years, the being sitting on the throne of the Yuuzhan Vong civilization had been a puppet. The real ruler, the actual Supreme Overlord, was the twisted jester behind the curtain, pulling strings through biological and force-based manipulation that none of the warriors, priests, or shapers had ever detected. Animi's goals were not conquest, exactly. He wanted to kill everything in the galaxy, not to terraform it, not to occupy it, but to perform a mass sacrifice so enormous that it would make him, in his own deranged theology, equivalent to Yuuzhan himself. The Creator God had sacrificed his body to create the universe. Animi would sacrifice a universe to create himself. He was the only force-sensitive Yuuzhan Vong in existence. And that made him, in a sense, the most tragic figure in the entire story. Jacen Solo fought him. Not in a physical sense. Animi's modifications made him biologically monstrous, spitting toxins, directing organic weapons. But Jacen, who had spent years since his captivity developing an understanding of the Force that went beyond any previous Jedi or Sith model, achieved in that fight something described in the novels as a state of complete oneness with the Force. Not aggressive connection, not defensive withdrawal. Total presence, where Jacen was simply a point through which the Force moved without resistance. He reversed Onimi's modifications, turned them back on their host. The body that had been augmented to channel Force power was undone by Force power, and Onimi died. When Onimi died, the worldship began to die. The Yuuzhan Vong felt it, not the death of Shimura that had registered as the death of a Supreme Overlord, serious but survivable. The death of Onimi was different. The actual connection that the Yuuzhan Vong had believed ran from their Supreme Overlord to Yuuzhan, that sacred line of divine authority, snapped. War Master Naz Choka surrendered. The final casualty count, spread across 5 years of invasion and war, reached approximately 365 trillion sentient beings. That number is difficult to hold in the mind. It is larger than any other death toll in Star Wars Legends history. It dwarfs the Clone Wars, dwarfs the Galactic Civil War, dwarfs every Sith campaign ever chronicled. 20 or more planets were effectively destroyed, not merely damaged or evacuated, but rendered uninhabitable or gutted at their ecological core. Coruscant turned Yuuzhan'tar, which now had to be terraformed back. Duro, Dantooine struck repeatedly. Entire populations displaced, scattered across refugee networks that collapsed under their own weight. The new republic, which had built itself as the democratic answer to 20 years of imperial tyranny, was dead. The Galactic Alliance that replaced it was a harder, more centralized entity, shaped by the war into something that would have been recognizable to military planners, but less familiar to the senators who had founded the Republic after Endor. The Jedi Order had lost people it could not replace. Anakin Solo, who might have been the most naturally gifted Force user of his generation, was gone at 18. Other Jedi had died across the war, some in battle, some in missions that failed, some in ambushes the Force hadn't warned them about because the attackers left no trace in it. And what happened to the Yuuzhan Vong? The surrender terms were negotiated between War Master Naz Choka and the Galactic Alliance. One of the conditions was that the remaining Yuuzhan Vong participate in the rebuilding of Coruscant. This was not purely punitive, it was also practical. The Vong understood living technology better than anyone in the galaxy, and undoing years of terraforming required that knowledge. Zonama Sekot, the living planet, carried the surviving Yuuzhan Vong, those who could not or would not be integrated into the Galactic Alliance, to the unknown regions. There, on that planet which turned out to be the literal biological seed of their ancient homeworld, they could begin again, not as conquerors, as refugees returning to something they had lost long before any of them were born. Nom Enor's ending was different. After the fall, with nowhere to hide, he met a quiet death among the ruins, his final deception unraveling. The Jedi heresy outlasted him. The shamed ones who had believed it had lost their prophet, but not their belief. Some integrated into the Galactic Alliance's occupied territories. Others followed Zonama Sekot. Luke Skywalker survived. Mara Jade Skywalker survived. Leia and Han survived, though the costs written into their faces and silences and refusals to discuss Anakin were permanent. Jaina Solo survived, carrying the title Sword of the Jedi like armor. Jacen Solo survived, changed in ways that not even he fully understood yet, his relationship to the Force having been rebuilt from scratch during years of torture, observation, and finally that single perfect moment of oneness in the fight with Onimi. What Jacen Solo became after the war is a different story for a different video. But if you know how the Legends timeline continues, you understand that the Yuuzhan Vong War planted something in him. The belief that the Force had no light side or dark side, only intention. That suffering could be chosen for a greater purpose. That a Jedi, if the stakes were high enough, could justify anything. That philosophy, offered to him in torture by Vergere, would shape the next decade of the Legends timeline into a darkness that in some ways cost as much as the war itself. The Yuuzhan Vong War is the most ambitious storytelling project in Star Wars Legends history. 19 novels, multiple authors writing in sequence, coordinating character arcs and plot threads across 5 years of publication. Characters who mattered died. Planets that had existed since the original films were destroyed. The moral certainties of the post-Endor era, that democracy had won, that the Jedi were guardians of a stable order, that the worst was behind the galaxy, all of those were examined, pressured, and in several cases broken. What made the Vong genuinely horrifying as an antagonist was the specificity of the horror. They were not evil in the cartoonish sense of power-hungry warlords or galaxy-conquering Sith. They were a civilization with internally coherent logic, a theology that made sense within its own framework, a history of genuine suffering that had made them what they were. They lost their homeworld. They spent centuries in the void between galaxies. They arrived at a new galaxy desperately needing a place to belong and convinced by their entire religious and cultural tradition that they had the divine right to take it by force. That doesn't make them sympathetic, it makes them comprehensible. And comprehensibility is more terrifying than pure evil. The other thing the Vong did was challenge the Force itself. By existing outside it, they forced the Jedi Order and its doctrine into a genuine crisis. If the Force connects all living things, what does it mean that this species of living beings has no connection? The answers the Legends novels reached: that the connection had been severed when Yuuzhan'tar was destroyed, that the original biological symbiosis with their homeworld had been their link and they had destroyed it themselves, are answers that have real emotional weight. The Yuuzhan Vong were cut off from the Force because they had killed the thing that connected them to it. They came to conquer a galaxy to replace a homeworld. They ended up on a planet that was their homeworld's biological child. The circle, in its way, closed. And as of the most recent Star Wars television content, the Ahsoka series, which sent characters physically outside the main galaxy for the first time in Disney canon, many Legends fans are watching closely. The mechanisms now exist in canon for something extragalactic and biological and ancient to find its way into a story. Whether the Yuuzhan Vong, or something inspired by them, will ever cross from Legends into the current timeline remains an open question. But the story exists, all of it. 25 years of publication, hundreds of characters, planets, battles, deaths, and the slow recovery of a civilization after the worst war in its history, waiting for anyone willing to read it. 5 years of war, 365 trillion dead, Coruscant fallen and recovered, Anakin Solo gone, Jacen Solo changed, the galaxy rebuilt under a different name, with different rules, carrying wounds that the political architecture tried to paper over and the surviving characters carried in their bodies. That's the Yuuzhan Vong War. Arguably the darkest, most sustained, most formally ambitious story Star Wars has ever told. Spread across a series of novels that treated their characters with the respect of genuine consequence. If this video gave you something, a story you didn't know, a detail you had forgotten, a reason to go read the new Jedi Order novels yourself, that's the goal. This lore deserves to be known by more people than have found it. Subscribe if you haven't already. There are deep dives on individual characters from this war planned for this channel. Nom Anor, Jacen Solo's full arc, Vergere's philosophy, the Shamed One's movement. Drop in the comments which one you want first. Share this video with anyone you know who loves Star Wars and doesn't yet know what Legends was capable of. And if you watched this whole thing, thank you. This story earned your time. The Yuuzhan Vong are coming. Whether in Legends or in whatever Disney decides the next chapter of Star Wars looks like, the void between galaxies is not empty. Something is out there watching. It always was.